This video addresses a recurring question of my viewers, or some viewers, and that is how to deal with a forceful opponent. Or in other words, would the approach to historical combat and sword fighting as propagated in my videos actually live up to an opponent who charges in with all his might, with all his force and strength? For more than 25 years now, I have been researching and reconstructing historical combat, historical sword fighting. And over the years, I have been practicing sword fighting in all kinds of modern contexts, that is, in the living history community, doing reenactment fencing, and later doing a number of years of traditional martial arts. I have participated in numerous tournaments, and over the course of years, there's a clear development. And at Dimicator nowadays, all our fencing has become very, very sensitive, and the pressure that we put into binds of swords becomes more and more subtle. There's less and less force, clearly. And of course, this shows in the videos. So oftentimes skeptics would say like, you're dancing, you're not actually trying to kill each other, there's not enough intent, and if anybody would actually charge you with force and intent, then you would be destroyed instantly. Now, of course, we're not trying to kill each other, obviously, but that also must have been true for historical fencers, for historical fighters training with each other, naturally. But if we want to address the question, if we're looking for an answer to whether or not skill was less important than force, or if force was actually the one factor that would determine the outcome of a historical fight, we can actually look into historical sources. We can see what people who were actually fighting with swords had to say about this subject. There is a source, a Fechtbook, a fight book. It's actually the first one of the so-called Lichtenauer tradition. Lichtenauer was a famous swordsman, a famous master of combat arts who probably lived in the 14th century. And his students left us with various sources, with various texts. And one of them says, and it's, as I said, the earliest one, which dates probably to the late 14th century. It's the manuscript HS 3227A, and there it says how to actually respond to pressure in a fight. It says, weak against strong, hard against soft, and vice versa. For if one was to respond to strength with force, then the stronger one would always win. This is why Lichtenauer's fighting follows true and veritable art, so that a weaker one with his art and stratagem wins complete victory, just as a strong one does due to his strength. Why else would there be any art? So for this reason, fighter learn to sense well. So apparently it says that strength does help, but it also implies that strength is totally useless without skill. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, because the idea of martial arts is that instinctive responses in a given combat situation are replaced by martially sound responses. And to this end, you need a lot of training. And if this training was any good, then you should be superior to somebody who's only using instinctive responses, that is, using strength and rushing in. Instead, it says that those people are inferior because they don't really sense pressure in bind, for instance, and thus would not be able to prevail against somebody who actually has learned these skills. Now, particularly when it's about Viking combat, whenever I come out with videos showing the results of my research into Viking Age armament, into the shields, into the swords, and then put this into practice, trying this out, showing video of this, then very often there are skeptics who say like, yeah, well, if somebody would charge in, he would just smash his axe into your shield and then pull it, and then he would cave in your head. And well, all my experience, and that of course is the limited experience of say 20 years of fighting in a modern context where it's not actually about killing, does actually not support this idea. Whenever I'm faced with somebody who's using a lot of pressure, then I find it really, really easy to beat that person. It's a bit like water. When water runs down a hill and it hits a rock, then it either is strong enough to just put the rock out of the way, wash it away, or if the rock is too big, the water would go either to the left or to the right. And so this picture, this image, is one that I use when I teach that if you are a skillful fighter, you are going where pressure takes you. And that's not only me saying that, it's also all my fellow instructors, whether they come from traditional martial arts or if they are reconstructing historical martial arts. It is one of the basics of martial arts. And there wouldn't be any martial arts if this would not be true, because it takes years and years and years of practice to actually ingrain the according responses in your body so that you can respond appropriately when, say, somebody is whacking his axe onto your shield. In fact, it's actually pretty difficult to whack an axe into a shield, but that's a different story. Well, anyway, so it's not only modern instructors of martial arts who constantly teach that principle of using strength against weakness, but then also using weakness against strength, and never ever using strength versus strength. Because if you use strength versus strength, then it becomes one of these ludicrous contests of pushing swords, like in Game of Thrones or whatever show you may like to watch. It's just stupid. It just doesn't make sense. And it's not a mere assertion by people who are practicing it these days. It's also here in the sources where it says, why else would there be any art? So there wouldn't be any martial arts. There wouldn't be any fight books that tell you learn to sense well. And when they say learn to sense well, this is about sensing pressure through a crossing of swords, for instance, but also crossing of shields or a shield bind, whatever. There wouldn't be these recommendations and these admonishments if they hadn't made sense in historical combat. And then if you look into the actual artifacts, if you look into historical shields, and I've examined quite a number of historical shields from various periods. So I have looked into the remains of Viking shields, earlier shields like Iron Age shields, high medieval shields like the ones that are kept at Marburg University Museum, the only surviving kite shields. And all these shields, they are rather light. They're often of a composite construction, but they are lightweight constructions. So they're not supposed to actually block something that comes in with force. So they're not supposed to be a strength or supply you with something that presses against an incoming blow. No, if they wouldn't even live up to it. And the combat damages that I noticed on one of these shields in particular, and that was the kite shield from Szczecin in Poland, there were like 4 cuts in the shield, in the front side of the shield, and only 2 of them showed on the rear side. Two of them didn't even penetrate the shield. It's very fine cuts, probably inflicted by a sword, and only one of these cuts actually cut into the edge. And on the front side, it's like maybe 7 centimeter cut, maybe 5 centimeter, I can't remember. And then on the rear side, it's only 2 centimeters. So that means that this shield, while it was used in combat, was used at the very edge of measure. So all the actual damages that were inflicted on it were with the very tip of the sword, which means those people had a great idea about measure, and that is fighting distance. And this is one thing that people don't understand when they say, I'm going to whack my shield, my sword or my axe into your shield. How? You first need to get there. But what if somebody is so good at judging measure, as is suggested by that particular shield, and as we are admonished to do in the historical treatises, if you cannot get there, what do you want to do? Of course, if you get there, then your opponent has made a mistake to begin with, yeah? But bridging distance takes time. And all the historical manuals teach you that there are critical distances, and you have to be fully aware of them. So if somebody charges in, he's actually bridging distance for me. So I could just wait, or I could yield and fight at the distance that is convenient to me. So it doesn't really work according to my experience. And I know that people will doubt this still. However, I'm one of those persons who say, well, you're welcome to try it out. Come to one of the fencing events that I organize. There are people coming from all over the world, and we can put on a lot of protection, and then you just try your forceful approach against me. I have no problem inviting people to do so because I know the outcome already. At a recent seminar, at a recent class in the United States, in Minnesota, at the Longhouse, which is a really nice training hall of my friend Arthur von Eschen, who runs the School for Viking Martial Arts named Asfolk in the Minneapolis area. The students were asking that very question too, and then we ran a little experiment where I would try to charge them and hit really, really hard, and then we also we swapped roles so that the student was attacking me, and this was video recorded, and this is what I'm going to show you now. I hope you're going to enjoy it. I'm forcefully bridging distance here, so I'm charging in like a ram or like a locomotive or whatever, like a train, like a steam train. I'm bridging distance very, very quickly, which is great for you. If I'm charging in so deeply, which is not actually very good for me, then you want to make sure that you are not exposed regarding your lower openings. Do it from the other way so we could both use the camera. It's kind of super easy to deal with people like that. Also, they give you a huge tempo, and they generally attack in time of the foot, which means they're actually using footwork or stepping to carry the whole weight of the body and the weapons towards you, which is super clumsy. So with people like that, I counter them to begin with by being extremely responsive and sensitive. So never ever make the mistake to mirror them by picking up on their overzeal. Sometimes you feel it, you sense this tension that people actually feel, and then it takes over. And if you have the same kind of tensions, it actually works against you. So one good tip is to start to smile. So start to smile and sense that somebody's about to be really forceful. And of course, oftentimes, as soon as they feel that they are getting in an inferior position, they will struggle against it. So they're violating the next principle, which is using strength versus strength. And then you deal with it in the same sensitive way too. So I'm going to do it again, and then of course I'll be hit anyway, but say this was a hit on the helmet or whatever, or he just keeps on fencing anyway. I will try to struggle against my position, and you just, you win by being slow in life, really. Because in my mind, the perception of the fight will be a very fast one, because I'm moving way too fast anyway. And with the second one, it's good if you actually make a hit, but it's more about seizing control with the shield. Okay. So I'll do it again, and it's more about taking your time. So in contrast to the person who's charging in and constantly wants to hit, you just take your time. If you are too inclined to engage, too obsessed with hitting yourself, then you're actually picking up on their speed in a sense. Okay. Yeah, which you shouldn't. You just should make that wait, give them enough rope so they hang themselves, and then you come and step them. Okay? Yeah, that's right. so this is what I usually do. So you just remain responsive, sensitive, and relaxed. And then it's actually pretty easy to deal with people that are forceful. And many don't really believe that. They think that if you come in there and you're super aggressive. And so this is one of the comments that I often get. They say, okay, this is really interesting, your approach, but what if brutality and aggression and adrenaline kicks in? Well, if this is indeed martial arts, then it shouldn't be a problem. So if you remain true to what you're doing, then it should be an even easier task for you, right? It's just, you have to have confidence into what you are doing, and then it should be fine. Let's just see, I'm going to try again, and I'm be forceful and use overzeal, and I constantly want to strike to the target, yeah. So you have to watch out, but if you are relaxed, it shouldn't be a problem. Remember that it makes sense to do something like that. If you use the weapons in conjunction, it makes your life easier. Okay? So forcing my way in result in constantly being hit over and over again. It doesn't really help me anyway. So, and then, of course, this. Here I was attacking you with a shield, yeah? So that was not super dumb. Some people don't do that. They hold the shield like this and then they really want to strike hard. But that's when you have to be aware that whatever you do is not about shield binds, but about positioning your shield. So don't even try to enforce a shield bind on somebody who neglects it. You just position your shield so that you are superior. So just remain true to your motion patterns and to what you were doing, and let's see what I can do. Sorry, oh, that's okay, I'm relieved. Yeah. So anybody who strikes at a shield hard, this gives you a great signal, and if you are aware of measure, then as he attacks, you should not be in reach anyway. So that also means that if he charges in and you are responding to him crossing distance very quickly, you must still try to impose your wedge in such a fashion that you first seize control and then you enter. Now this could be combined with seizing control, and while he's still forcing his way in, you strike from where you are, because that means you're seizing control out of measure, and then he keeps on bridging measure for you, so you don't even have to take a step in. Yeah? So you can address it and approach it in a very intellectual way if you just deconstruct the various principles we were looking at. You want to try one more? Sure.
This is reasonably safe.
Yeah. And always keep on going, so you stay true to your motion patterns. So even you have hit once, I will usually go on and make sure that I keep moving like a snake. Because if you stop just because I stop, that's then again you're picking up on me. You want to make sure that you control them completely. So if you give me a forceful approach instead. Yes, I guess so. So struggling and forcing your way in is actually not going to be any good, because this is mainly because of two things. The first is, if you are using force all the time, you can impossibly be responding to pressure correctly. So when they say in all martial arts, but also even in the late medieval treatises, respond with weakness to strength and vice versa. If you're using strength all the time, there'll be a moment when you are actually responding to strength with strength because you're using it all the time. So that's wrong. So by the logic of martial arts, the one who actually does pick up on pressure, signals and goes where pressure takes him, will be superior at the end. That's the one thing. But the other thing is, we have a very careful approach in regards to bridging distance. Like this weekend we were looking at establishing a shield bind at a point where we're actually not in reach. So if we lower our shields here, we cannot actually hit each other, but we can already start to try to gain control. Now when I feel like I have control, only then I actually move in. All right? Now if I'm constantly going in, charging in like a steam train, I can't make use of that approach. And that means that I give you a huge tempo, a huge motion, and you beat the action of the opponent in the time that he's determined and committed to a particular action. This is something that sounds very abstract to people who are not familiar with fencing theory, but sports fencers, for instance, they are great role models for that kind of approach, because they are picking up on tempo, and they're choosing the moment that they're doing something very, very carefully. So if we are sensitive fighters and we're doing something, do your thing, then at times I may wait for you to actually do something. So here you were in the process of doing something, so you were determined to a particular action. I chose that one to act myself and turn the odds against you. Right? So this sophisticated approach to striking the opponent when he is determined and engaged, absorbed in a particular action, committed to a particular action, you cannot possibly do that when you're on the steam train and keep charging in. It's impossible, because that's like a endless tempo or succession of huge tempos one after the other. So yeah, so this is what I would do. And again, remember that if somebody's denying a shield bind, that's not your problem, right? You still place your shield in space. So that's a good position. And when you feel like you can safely enter, that's what you do. And it's not your problem that I never actually try to establish a shield bind. So if you are refusing a shield bind against me, pretend to be a fighter that doesn't want to bind but keeps this as mobile armor, waiting for a moment to actually strike. So just use this approach. So I've just positioned my shield in such a fashion that I'm taking the center. So if you were a clever fighter and you had actually tried the same, then the same situation would look more like so. So here I win the bind. So see, here we have a shield bind and I'm striking at you, but it's the position of my weapon in space that makes me strong. If you deny this bind, it's still a strong position. Because as they say, I don't win by the strength of my arm, I win by the positioning of my weapons. Yeah? This makes sense? Cool. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm pretty sure there will still be people who say, yeah, you didn't try hard enough, and this was only practice, and if it's about true combat, adrenaline kicks in, and then the instincts take over, and you cannot actually do all these subtle moves. Not if you have not trained for many, many years. This is why it says in another source from about 1250, where a veteran gives advice to the warriors in the Norwegian king's guard. He says, he admonishes them to train twice per day, and he says, this art is only useful if it is being mastered. So, of course, if your skill is not good enough, then you will not prevail against strength. And mind you, I'm not saying strength is useless. You do need strength to actually use these weapons. But when you look at them, when you look at the artifacts, then you will realize that first, they were really difficult to make, right? If a sword was supposed to be used like a club, then why make a sword in the first place? My fellow instructor Guy Windsor once said, well, a sword is a labor-saving device. And anybody who has done any test cutting, or anybody who accidentally cut himself by, I don't know, cutting some meat or whatever, or doing some carving, knows that a sharp blade ludicrously easily cuts into flesh. Its blades are just blades are there because blades work, and you can easily destroy them if you use them incorrectly. If it's two blades meeting and they are struck into each other with a lot of force, then you're going to ruin them. And because we are still left with so many original swords that are still intact, we know that these swords were not used in that fashion. And I have examined a sword from the 11th century, which is so nicely honed, and it's just amazing that with tools that were available at the time, you could do such a wonderful job on this steel, which is very different to modern steel. These were precision instruments. They were not meant to be forcefully struck somewhere. In contrast, you need to understand the physics of the sword and use it accordingly, so that the power that you actually use, that the impact power on the receiving end is produced by using the physics of the sword, so that whatever you do feels effortless to you, but creates a lot of damage on the receiving end. And that is another definition of martial arts, to yield the maximum result with minimum effort. So when, for instance, and that's a quote from a passage from a book that was written by Stephen Perlman. It's nothing to do with sword fighting. It's all about traditional martial arts. But Stephen Perlman wrote the Book of Martial Power, and there he describes that one guy at the dojo was hitting the sandbag really hard, and then he said, like, "Oh, this was a really, really hard strike. I could feel it all through my body." And then Perlman writes out, "No, that was a faulty blow. If you punch and you feel it, that's not the idea. The sandbag or the opponent is supposed to feel the power." So the way to use a sword is to understand the sword, and that's part of the reason why I do all this research. And it turns out that the hilts of the swords, they are meticulously designed, and even though the aesthetics of the day was to create the impression of a symmetrical sword, it turns out that the makers of these swords used subtle means to tweak the symmetry, because the gripping hand is asymmetrical. That's why all the knives in your kitchen don't have symmetrical grips. They have asymmetrical grips to assist the function. And the same is true for swords. Even if they look symmetrical, if the hilt does look symmetrical, it turns out they were tweaked so that they were optimized, and optimized for very subtle grips that are actually shown in the historical manuals, and that can be applied to swords that come from eras much earlier. And even that student of Lichtenauer, who left us with a quote that I read to you earlier in the video, he said that his master, Johannes Lichtenauer, he didn't invent that art. It was found and invented many hundred years ago. So even in the 14th century, they had this perception, they had this idea that martial arts is age old. It comes from an era long past. And that means that those swords were used with skill, with a martial art, and else there wouldn't be any swords, because using them as a club just doesn't work.